Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. I would just like to say a few words about our first speaker, Lillian Xu. Lillian is the Vice President of the podcast business at Vox Media, where she leads strategic initiatives, franchise expansions, partnerships, and business operations. She has played a key role in talent deals with cultural icons like Andy Roddick, Lonzo Ball, and Cam Hayward, among others. Before joining Vox Media, Lillian led strategy and business development at New York Public Radio, helping to grow top podcasts like Radio Lab and the New Yorker Radio Hour. The title of Lillian's talk is So You Want to Start a Podcast. Please help me in welcoming Lillian Xu.
Hi guys, it's so nice to be back in State College. I was born and raised in State College, so last time I was here, we were actually selling my childhood home last year, so it's the first time driving back downtown since then. It's very nice to be here for happier reasons. It was hard to sell my home, but thank you, Katie, for the introduction. I am Lillian Xu. I help lead the podcast business at Vox Media, and we can talk a little bit more about that later, but I really wanted to spend generally today sharing a little bit more about how to go from 0 to 1 when you are thinking about starting a podcast. And I think a lot of people have different reasons and goals for why they want to start a show, so we can kind of talk through the full gamut of it. But depending on whether you want to make it a serious business, there's a part of today that I'll talk to you a little bit about, because we obviously run a podcast business. It is a big business revenue generating line for us in different ways, and I think as an independent podcaster, or however you guys are coming into it, there's a lot of different ways to achieve your goals, and we can talk about all of that. But before I get into it, I do want to kind of get a sense from the people in the room and online why you guys are here today, because ultimately I want the time to be helpful for everyone, and I've prepared some slides. We can go through all of these, but I do want it to be a dialogue. I won't have all the answers to every question that you have, but I probably know something that might be helpful. And yeah, I would love to just hear from 2 or 3 people, what brought you here today, just to get a sense. And it can be I was forced to be here, or maybe you have just a general curiosity, or maybe there are existing podcasters in the room, but would love to get a sense from anyone here. Yeah.
Volunteer.
Thank you.
I work for the university in the
Great.
government relations office. I think I'm a consumer of all things podcasts, so interested in that respect, but also
Great.
we've always, I think that as a media and comms person, you're always looking to evolve and continue your evolution of media. So maybe I'm not starting a podcast now, but down the road, this could be something to, a great foray into that, and also just love supporting what Penn State does.
Yeah. Awesome. One more? What about you, my elevator friend?
Yeah. I'm also an avid podcast listener, but
Yeah.
in terms of the content today, I'm more here kind of thinking on behalf of my son. So my son's a psychology major at the university, but he's also a part-time performer, and he has a lot of things to say about a lot of different topics.
Cool.
He's mentioned podcasting, particularly around mental health issues in the past. So this could be something that it might be a career move for him.
Cool.
At some point.
Wow, what a good dad. That's so nice. Matt, I don't know if there's any other folks online that have written anything specific that they wanted to hear. Okay, well, we can get into it. And I first wanted to start out just by sharing a little bit about Vox Media, so you know what I do every day. And then we can talk a little bit more about the podcasting piece of this. So Vox Media, there's 2 parts of Vox Media. One is our suite of editorial brands. We actually own around a dozen brands, including New York Magazine, Vox.com, Eater, The Cut, The Verge for tech, SB Nation, Vulture, and many more, The Dodo for pet lovers. And our podcast business was born out of our editorial brand. So journalists from Vox and The Verge wanted to express themselves in a new medium, and so they started figuring it out very scrappily. How do we record a podcast? and podcasts like Today Explained from Vox.com were born, Vergecast from The Verge. And then from there, we established this audience growth infrastructure. We established a way to sell all of our podcasts, and we have a great central production team. So from there, we started working with people who might have started making a podcast on their own or had a concept of a podcast. And through various means, whether it's us cold outreaching to people that we think are great, or people pitching to us, or people have an existing show, there's like a whole suite of agents that are pitching us constantly. We now have a portfolio of shows and talent, around a little over 30 shows today. A lot of that, our goal generally is to have a top podcast across every consumer passion point. But the bedrock of a lot of our shows are in the business and tech space, coming out of Vergecast. We work with Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway on Pivot, and they each have their own shows. We've been expanding a lot into sports this year. That's something I've been spending a lot of time on. Did cold outreach to Andy Roddick because I was listening to his podcast Serve, which has become a really incredible space for tennis discussion. And you know, ESPN only covers tennis 4 times a year. And so he's been doing year-round coverage. He just interviewed Rafa for his first post-retirement interview. And that interview a few years ago might have taken place in a very different outlet. So kind of epitomizes how central podcasting has become in the sports media ecosystem and media more broadly. We have a great show that we started last year with Sue Bird and Megan Rapinoe called A Touch More, and we're actually starting a new show with Sue specifically focused on the WNBA. Not announced yet, but it's going to be called Bird's Eye View, which is a fun title, and it will feature her and a lot of existing, like, current active players. We also work with folks like Marquez Brownlee, who obviously is huge in YouTube. He has MKBHD as his YouTube channel, but he also has an active podcast. And the way that we work with all of these people, like Brene Brown or Esther Perel, who's a relationship psychotherapist, it really depends on basically what they need and want. Some people are just 2-people teams and they really need support throughout the gamut. Other people have, like Scott, has a very flourishing, he has a big company and he has people that he employs full time, and so we're really just serving as a business and strategic partner. But with all of these shows, if you look over on the left, this is kind of like our goal with building our ecosystem of shows. We're not really trying to have thousands of anonymous shows that are just in a big catalog. We're really trying to build a cross-platform show or media franchise where the show is at the center of it. It can be expressed in audio or video. It's interesting to hear some of you guys talk about how you're listeners. A lot of people consider themselves viewers now of podcasts because video is a really big entry point, especially for different generations, not even just younger generations, but some people who are discovering content on YouTube and they don't even realize that they're absorbing a podcast. Social, live, we just did a 3-day podcast stage at South by Southwest, which I'll show you some pictures from. And then these 3 like buckets over here are kind of different monetization elements. You can advertise on the show and make big advertising revenue, but you can also think about licensing your content to an ESPN. A lot of ESPN2 now has various podcasts. Obviously, Pat McAfee is an example of that. Membership, a lot of these shows might have people paying for exclusive content, whether that's on audio or whether it's on newsletter, which is often like a byproduct or another part of a podcast. So that's just the broadest sense. If you are doing what I'm doing, which is trying to make a lot of money from podcasts, like this is kind of the full gamut. But obviously, like when you're starting out, there are different things to think about. So that's what we're going to spend the bulk of today talking about, which is how to start a podcast when you just have an idea that you might want to do one and what to think about. And here are just some pictures from South by last year. Didn't have time to update. We just had South by 2 weeks ago. This year had 12 live shows and featured people like Chelsea Handler, Tim Walz, Liz Warren. But this is like our Avengers Assemble moment. It's a really cool opportunity for all of our hosts to come together and meet each other. A lot of them have no idea what each other does, but there's a lot of mutual respect. So I think that's kind of the through line is experts and premium content. Okay, so I am going to pause there. Any questions on Vox Media before we get into podcasting generally? Okay. So today I just want to talk a little bit about some things that we've touched on already, how media is changing, how you can think about opportunities in podcasting, and then some of the like 101 how to be successful components, which we can get into a little bit more. But this graph is not surprising, I think, for all of us who are intuitive about media consumption. TV viewership is going down, and the viewers of media that aren't paying for TV are increasing. And this is putting a lot of pressure on a lot of these traditional networks, like the ESPNs and the Fox Sports of the world. This is a little bit more sports driven because I made this presentation for a sports audience last time. But I think on the other hand, it's easier than ever to become a media personality. Before, I think a lot of people, like last time I was talking about podcasting, it was to a group of former pro football players. Before, their end-all be-all was to be on ESPN. Today, they're thinking about, okay, how do I have like my own platform, how do I start? And a lot of them have big social platforms, so that's another big part of discovery. And so it's easier than ever to start, harder than ever to stand out because everyone and their mother is making their own podcast. So I think what we talk a lot about with talent that is starting a new podcast, with people who have an idea, is why now, and what is the concept really? Because you can't just be a famous person, and a lot of us in this room probably aren't famous people, but even when you are a famous person, a lot of people are like, okay, I'll just have all of my famous friends and they all have millions of followers, but we've all seen how that doesn't really lead to habit forming viewership or listenership, and so we talk a lot about like how to actually make that happen. But a lot of people who have made it are the ones like Shannon Sharp, or obviously the biggest story of the last couple of years is New Heights with Jason and Travis, The Pivot. These are people who are really hustling and thinking about what the show is going to be and putting in a lot of work. I mean, Shannon Sharp is not even doing really like a football. I would say these first two examples, you're not really even covering football as a centerpiece of it, but they knew that they were known for football, so they didn't immediately start doing a pop culture show, which is important as well. But a lot of these people who are coming in, another example that's not on here is Jeff Teague's podcast, Club 520. A lot of people have no idea who Jeff Teague is, but that is one of the biggest sports podcasts, and that just shows how your name, or even JJ, like when JJ Redick started Old Man and the Three, he wasn't really like one of those players that people thought about right away, but he made one of the best shows. So it's all about that work ahead of time. But if your goal is to make a business out of this, which some, by the way, that doesn't have to be your goal. Some folks like you might just be trying to reach a broader audience in a different way and have a long form conversation that's a little bit more engaging than social content or text content. But if you do want to think about the full suite, this is kind of what I was talking about with the spokes and wheels earlier, a podcast at the end of the day is just a direct to consumer digital show. It can express itself in audio, video, there can be clips on social, you can be doing live shows, you can be doing community meetups, it can be syndicated on TV. But at the end of the day, we're here for Startup Week. I think the biggest thing for making a really successful show is thinking of it as a startup, as a media business. You know, it might not be your goal in day one, but if you actually want to build a big audience, it really is a bet on yourself type of endeavor. The way that, you know, I'm sure lots of people will be talking about this throughout this week, but it really is starting a media company. In the best of worlds, you're creating an entire ecosystem that could be monetized. And so I think the benefit of this is you can own your IP in a way that in the past a lot of people would just show up on media as talent, you get paid a talent fee, but if it blows up, you're not participating in the upside. The other opportunity is that you can have a lot more creative control. The cons are it's a ton of work. It's like a corporate job versus starting your own job and starting your own company. And we talked about this earlier, it's just very difficult to break through and make a hit on the large scale of things. And even, depending on what your target audience is, I think the biggest piece is you have to define what your own success metric looks like. But even people who might not want to be reaching millions of people, it is really hard to break through and make a hit unless you're thinking about some of the things that we're talking about later today. Any questions or comments or things before I move on? Yeah.
I think for the video component for myself, because I feel like for everybody in this room,
Yeah.
but like podcasts were always audio forward.
Yeah.
And audio first, and like you said, they are becoming more video.
Yeah.
Like adjacent even. Do you think that there's going to be that kind of point where people are like they do go towards more video and less towards audio? Because there's so many times you listen to a podcast and they're like, that's not really great for the audio listeners right now. Do you think that there's a point where it's going to be like kind of that nexus happens where it crosses?
Yeah, and I think it's happening now, actually. I think, well, first there's two things. One, people aren't just an audio or a video listener. There are people who will flex across both. Like we talk, there's imperfect data around this, but whenever we're talking to YouTube, a lot of people, I think, will start midway through a video podcast because they might be driving and then they're finally at a place to sit down. And now people are even increasingly casting their podcast onto their smart TVs. So it's replacing a lot of traditional TV viewership where you're hanging out with people in your living room, whereas before that would have been cable TV. So I think the biggest piece of why this is happening, it's not necessarily that people like you are becoming video watchers, which is some of the case because you might observe like, okay, this show is actually probably made to be video first. Some of these newer shows are very visual. A lot of the sports shows are like made to be consumed on video, and so you would have the most optimized viewership or consumption experience on video. But the bigger trend is that YouTube is the second largest search engine. And it has a huge consumer base, and a lot of people who don't know how to, like my parents, they have no idea what I do, but they were math professors at Penn State. They are like, I don't know, I'm like sending them podcast links on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and they're like, I don't know how to use these apps, but they know how to consume things on YouTube because like YouTube has done a good job at reaching people across all sorts of demographics. So the discovery element is just growing the pie in general, and it's bringing in a lot of different people, or a lot of Gen Z are discovering via TikTok clips that take them to YouTube or take them to Spotify, for example. So a lot of the shows that have been launched in the last 2 years, if you look at their platform breakdown, a lot of the consumption is YouTube and Spotify first, and Apple is like very little, which is an interesting kind of commentary on how people are thinking about what a podcast is, and also to your point, like how much video plays a role in it. It's a really good question, and it's something we talk about a lot. Yeah.
So kind of related
Great.
And I've also been a podcaster for several years. And, you know, the standard wisdom for a long time was you have to have like a really niche target audience to be able to build an audience. And I often critique my students who say, well, my target audience is anybody 18 to 30. I'm like, well,
Yeah.
that's too broad. But
Right.
I guess I wonder, given some of what you were just saying about how YouTube and some of these other these other platforms are coming online, do you think that that's changing at all? Like, is it possible to be successful with a more general audience, or is still being more targeted or more niche the way to go?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and to me that ties into content strategy, which is augmented by the platform and audience discovery. But when you are something for everyone, you're for nobody at the same time. So I think, like, to your point, where we see people cutting through, even with all this discovery happening today, no one's searching generic podcasts on YouTube, right? Like, they're like looking for something specific, and because there's more content than ever, I think often having like a clear sense of who your target person is still very helpful. We often don't, when we're talking to our talent, we're not thinking about like, okay, you need to define exactly what age range they are, or exactly like, you know, like in Project Runway, they're like, oh, who is your woman? Like, describing your woman. We have a little bit of that, but we're not trying to like pin it so funneled in, because there are like the unexpected kind of other audience, like, or there might be two types of people that you're trying to target. But to answer your question, like, I still think the wisdom that you're sharing is accurate, even with further discovery, because it's more crowded, so you do have to be more specific. Yeah.
So at Vox, do all your shows have a video component, or are you moving in that direction?
Yeah, really good question. So we have like 35 shows right now, and I would say probably half of them are on video, and some of them will never be on video. And some of them are transitioning from clips into full episode video, and some of them are only going to do social video for discovery and broad awareness, but aren't going to be doing full episode video. And there are a few reasons for that. I mean, the way that we think about this platform expansion piece is the editorial strategy at the centerpiece of it. We're never going to be doing video for video's sake. It's expensive. There's glam involved, which is another like whole thing. People, I mean, the intimacy of podcasts in the beginning was, the beauty is like you can roll out of bed and guest on someone's podcast and not worry about what you look like, and people behave differently when they're on camera. So certain shows don't lend themselves to that. And then we have a podcast called Criminal, which is basically a beautiful narrative of a true crime, not in the grisly way, but like a true crime story, and it's highly produced and edited, and it would be like a feature documentary every single episode if it were in video. So that will never make sense unless someone gives us like $1 billion to do it. But also they're making a new episode each week, so it, like, output-wise, or like Today Explained, our daily news podcast, that's another one where it's like going to be really hard, highly produced, high output, but we're experimenting with, can we get some of the benefits of the new platforms by doing some social video, maybe shoulder content where you're like recording new stuff to talk about what is covered in the audio episode, but not everything is going to be transferred. It's more like the chat podcasts that lend themselves to easier transit.
You talk about how hard it is to break through in some of the changing economics. I mean, we're seeing Spotify cut back on a lot of its exclusive deals.
Yeah.
iHeart is kind of flailing around with their portfolio.
Yeah.
How are you thinking about, do we expand? Do we contract? Do we rationalize? Do we continue growing? What's in your mind when one of those agents pitches you on a new idea?
Well, I think taking, like, at a very high level, Vox Media specifically, we are in growth mode. We added 12 shows last year, and we're looking to do more. And we talk a lot about, if last year we were more like a growth equity mindset where we're talking to later stage companies. This year, we're more operating with a VC mindset where we're thinking about earlier stage, starting shows, we're doing more piloting. And I think we're able to do that because we've always operated a sustainable business. There was a huge boom in the early 2020s where Spotify, Amazon, all these big platforms were making big minimum guarantees to different talents. And they weren't, and those shows didn't have some of the things that we were talking about. I think Meghan and Harry is a good example where, or the Obamas, where they did, they thought people were famous, we could give them $20 million or more, and it didn't pan out to something successful. So for us, we're always growing in a curated way because our differentiating factor in the market is that we have premium shows that are at that standard of, like, we say we're talking to people who want to be at the intersection of influence and authority. We have a standard of not peddling misinformation, which seems very trite to say, but is not a guarantee for a lot of our competitors. And I think as we're talking to potential talent, we're thinking about, can we work with these people for 10 years? Are they in it for 10 years? Is someone doing this for a quick cash grab? Because if so, we're not going to be the best partner for them. And by the way, you can make a ton of money for like a 1-year deal, but we're not in a place to churn different shows all the time. So that is yes, we are growing, and I think in a thoughtful way. And I think because of the shift in the industry, as video comes in, as there's more advertiser interest, as there's different ways, we're seeing a lot of success with live as well. So there's a lot of different revenue streams in addition to talent coming in, and we're in a good position to grow from there. Yeah, good question. Informed question. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, so this next section is, not everyone is going to be wanting to start a podcast themselves, but I think what we always talk to our talent about, or if I'm talking to like former athletes or something when they're thinking about starting a show, one is like, what does success look like? What are you actually trying to build? And that can look really different for different people. Some answers are, hey, I like am really disconnected from my brothers, and like we grew up all playing different sports, and now we just want to have like built-in hang time, and if we can do something fun, and I like don't need money, I get paid like $40 million a year on my football contract. I just want to build something that we can, like an archive of our family content. Like that's one version. Another version can be like, I want to make this my full-time job, which is another end of the spectrum. The second piece of this is the time investment of making a show. In order to make a show that actually can create a business out of it, you really do need to be making something that can be part of everybody's weekly habit. So you'll probably see this and observe more and more. Back in the day, I think Serial was like the primary example of a podcast. There are fewer and fewer of these seasonal, highly produced narrative shows because, very unfortunately, the business model hasn't really caught up to it. So the New York Times, which has bought Serial, like they can afford to keep doing that occasionally, but most of their shows, most of our shows, most of everybody's shows are weekly, always on shows because the bulk of the business is advertising. Advertisers want predictable audience. They want to be part of a kind of a habit-driven listenership. And even with the most successful shows like Serial, their listenership still does change a lot season to season, even though the audience base in audio is much stickier than in video, which is another thing that we can talk about in a minute, which is video, great discovery mechanism, very inconsistent. People are just not sticking around. It's not a high quality audience necessarily because of the nature of how you discover it. But I say all of that because if you want to do this in a real way, you're looking at like 40 to like, hey guys, the screen turned off. I don't know if we, but we're looking at like 40 to 50 episodes a year, which is a lot of content to make. Is there some tech help that we can get with maybe I'll just unplug and replug. TV? Okay. But yeah, that is a ton of content. I think it is a kind of a blocker for people when they're thinking about starting something. That being said, if you're not doing it for monetary reasons, if you want to start like a seasonal podcast for Penn State, for example, like you don't have to do 50 episodes necessarily, but if you want to monetize it, it is kind of like a weekly endeavor. I'm just gonna pause. Yeah, let's ask some questions while we let the tech folks. Yeah. Yeah.
I like your graphic where it was podcast at the top and kind of with all those different entry points of how
Mm-hmm.
you can create a podcast, get involved in it, or even just what a podcast is. Is there a different way that you would recommend for people to get started into creating a podcast as a whole? Should they start with social? Should they start with, YouTube, like long form? Like what method and entry point do you think would be the most successful?
I think today a lot of people are starting out with, if you have the resources to do it, I would say you want to have the algorithms work for you, because the way that you got big 10 years ago, like Criminal, they just did it organically. There weren't that many people, and Apple and Spotify would recommend the few shows that were out there, and then people would stay there, and then you have a sticky audience, and suddenly you have like hundreds and thousands of people. But the way that discovery works on the audio apps is really poor. Like, I don't know if you guys have tried searching stuff on Apple and Spotify. It's not built great, because for Apple, like, it's not a big revenue priority for them at all, so they have no incentive to optimize the user experience there. And the things that are surfaced on the homepage are all people, like our marketing team is pitching Apple like every week saying, hey, feature this show. We have a direct relationship with the platform. So a lot of those shows are from very established brands, whereas you do hear of more of these organic shows that kind of just pop up out of nowhere because of the YouTube algorithm or social algorithm supporting. So I do think for the people who are socially native and have the ability to do, it doesn't have to be super hi-fi on video either. The algorithm can help if you don't have a marketing person that's pitching a lot of your stuff today. And again, it all comes down to what the show actually is. We always start with like the editorial strategy, but yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Mm-hmm.
So first, you talked a lot about time and resources.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about what that would look like for someone who's just starting out? Like, what
Yeah.
should you plan to invest on day one if you want to move forward with this?
I think the first thing, the time piece is like really figuring out what the show is and what your ambition for the show is, because everything kind of flows from there. I would say, podcasting started out with people doing stuff in their garage. You still can do that today. That's the beauty of it. You don't need a huge team. And I would say that getting a good mic and getting a good camera, if you want to do video, is already, which is not super expensive, is already going to put you above a lot of people who are kind of more beginner podcasters. sound quality to me is like a big differentiating factor in how legitimate something sounds, and then therefore like how a user will engage with it. You actually hear a lot of podcasts today. Like one of my favorite podcasts that I listen to is The Town by Puck, and it's like a media news podcast, but it has really bad sound quality. And like as a result, obviously like I'm a very biased listener because I'm listening to a lot of podcasts every week, but it like turns me off. And I think we've found that to be really true. So equipment wise, I would say getting a really good mic, recording it in a place that doesn't have a lot of sound. And then there's tons of AI tools today that can really help with the post-production. So I think cost-wise, it's really, your time is gonna be the most expensive piece of it. And we're gonna talk about this in a minute if this first slides ever get set up, but about if the different like roles in thinking about building a show, because some of those roles will end up just being you if you're starting, but there's obvious areas of where you can work with someone else, whether that's on the marketing side or the editing or sound engineering, things like that. And some of those team members can be AI tools in today's day and age, yeah.
So my other question was, you've talked a lot about personality so far.
Yeah.
But if there is a small business just starting out, maybe it's a product-based business, and they want to figure out if podcasting is a good outreach channel for them
Yeah.
to either drive sales, increase awareness, become a thought leader in a space, what kind of when or what value would podcasting provide for someone who's really like early stage in
Yeah.
their business before they would even think about podcasting? Like what would be that moment that would be the right next move?
I have my general advice to businesses or like companies that are like looking to start a podcast is you probably shouldn't. Because the question is like, if you're trying to, I'll caveat that. If you're trying to like reach a mass audience and reach new people, think about people who are just doing it for their main business. It's hard enough to cultivate audience. And then if you're like a corporation or even a small business and you're trying to like start and reach more people, podcasting is not the easiest way to do that. Where it does make sense, I think, is if you want to build a really engaged community, or if you want to have a long form space to share more detail, and then that content can be used elsewhere on your website or leveraged elsewhere. I think that's like the best way to think about a podcast for a small business that wants to do it. But there's so many VCs that have a ton of money. They're like starting all these podcasts to have like their investors be thought leaders and show up that way, and no one listens to them, and it's a waste of time and energy, and it becomes this like kind of, you're just like, it's an echo chamber of you bringing on your friends and like talking to each other. I do think that it can be useful for building community and engaging people again, like in long form, and ideally you're using the content in other ways, so it's not just an end to a means on its own. But yeah, I would say a better way to use the platform is to show up on other podcasts, be a guest, pitch yourself to places that are featuring small businesses. There are a ton of podcasts that like are looking for entrepreneurs at smaller scales, SMBs, and then you're reaching kind of a scaled audience, semi-scaled audience versus starting from scratch, which is a lot harder. Yeah, go ahead.
So do you think it's more beneficial for people just starting out, like for a podcast to do like visual and like maybe put on YouTube where people can watch it, or audio and they can just listen to it like on Spotify?
This is kind of like tied to Katie's question earlier, where if you are trying to get the most people in, it's the algorithms on YouTube are helpful for discovery. That being said, like that comes with a cost too. Like you have to set up video, you have to figure out the best way to show up on YouTube. The most extreme way is like Mr. Beasting it, where you're like analyzing all of the data, and it becomes this it's really interesting. We just talked to one of the guys on Mr. Beast's team, which is like, or Diary of a CEO, where their entire content strategy is based off of what they're learning from the data. It's not even like a show or editorially driven thing. They're just trying to get as many people and as many eyes as possible. So that is one extreme of how you can think about it, but you have to figure out the titles, the thumbnails. There's a lot of time investment and money spent on like how to show up there correctly. I think if you're really just getting started, like I would always say, like playing around in a pilot, like an audio and video, and really mastering like what you want to sound like and what the show really is. Audio is like an easier way to just start. I think a lot of people get stuck trying to make it look really good, and then they never make an episode. And so the most ideas die there. I would say like other ideas die after like 5 episodes, and then some ideas just keep going and they never grow, but like the persistence is kind of what gets you to get started. So I'm like answering a little bit differently than I answered Katie, but like if you just want to start, like I would say just record something as soon as possible and then keep iterating from there, because the worst place is like if you don't end up making anything because of the visual component. Yeah, of course. Matt, any luck with the?
So the live stream is still live. So
Okay.
The Q&A is great right now.
Great.
Unfortunately, we're gonna have to troubleshoot this after the session.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, I'll just try to voice over some. It's nothing exciting, super or super visual, but the next slide we already talked about this, but like the key phases of starting a podcast. 1, develop a show concept. 2 is building a team and making a plan. The 3rd stage is like piloting, which is kind of what I was talking about, and refining your concept. And then after you do a little bit of rehearsal, that's when I would start releasing episodes. Some people start releasing right away, and that first episode does matter. So thinking through that. And then the last piece is once you have something in the world, it is really about promoting and building your audience. So I'll talk a little bit more about the key components of a team, which is tied to your question. 1, most shows have a host. So that is the key role. That's the on-camera, on-mic role. The second key role is a producer, and that often is the host. But that's someone who's doing prep, who's doing research. If you are doing an interview, they will prep interview questions. They are the ones who are helping with booking sometimes if you don't have a separate booker. The third is post-production. So post-production is, again, sometimes this is all one person, but an editor for audio and video. You're recording, let's say, a lot of episodes are like raw, like 90 minutes. They might be cut to an hour or 45. The pros, like Scott and Kara, have very little editing, but a lot of people, like Megan and Sue right now, they sometimes are recording for 2 hours because they just like can't stop talking about all of the great things, and then that person is cutting down all of the tape. Another post-production role is a sound engineer who is working out the levels. Again, that can be like an AI tool. A lot of tools have like auto noise cancellation of sirens or things in the background. And then the final piece is a marketing muscle. That can be you. Again, all of this can be one person, but marketing across social, across YouTube, thinking about some of the other things that we'll talk about. But those, I would say, are the 4 like key pieces, 5 key pieces of work. And then the last thing I kind of wanted to end on was this building an audience piece is the last piece of the never-ending cycle, but the last piece of this, like, after it's out in the world, how do you build an audience? And the first component is just making good content. Word of mouth is still the most helpful, I think, in driving audience. Guesting and promotions on other podcasts is then the second most effective. Anytime that you're reaching an already existing listener, they're the most likely to kind of go somewhere else on another podcast. And so, or an organic mention, for example. There's like a Joe Rogan effect of whether he talks about a podcast and how viral it goes. A recent example of that is there's this new show called The Telepathy Tapes, where it's about this indie documentary filmmaker. She, again, audio only, so it's very hard to find organically, but she was interviewing autistic kids about like kind of telepathic, unexplainable phenomenon, and two podcasts talked about it, including Joe Rogan, and then it became like the most popular podcast that came out of nowhere. That doesn't happen that often, but it just shows the power of reaching a big existing podcast base versus the third piece, which is social. Social is not a big driver of conversion generally, but it is helpful because the algorithm will do the work for you in terms of reaching people that might be interested in that content. And then general other platform things, using your own platform if you have any social presence. Pitching to Apple and Spotify, there is a public-facing form. It's really difficult to get on there, which is why I always say that for someone just starting out, like YouTube and social is easier because you don't have to rely on these gatekeepers to put your content in front of people. And then the last piece is PR, press, paid marketing. Those are, again, I would not really advise that for like a non-corporate entity, but we do think about placing stories, and on YouTube occasionally we'll do paid marketing as well. Any questions on the marketing stuff? Last thing I'll say is on the business model, and then we can, I think, close there and answer any other questions from folks online. Okay, last piece of this, how do you make money? Primary thing I mentioned earlier, advertising. The way that we make money today, when you listen to a podcast, you'll hear an ad probably at the beginning, ad breaks in the middle, and then at the end. And those are making millions and millions of dollars for shows and companies like us. So advertising today can be sold by like a company like Vox Media, which is selling direct. There's also like programmatic advertising that's provided by places like Spotify or iHeart. They all have these mechanisms where if you just join their network, they'll plug in ads. They're just selling mass scale, and those are like the radio sounding pre-produced ads versus an ad that's read by the host. The second tier that is growing but is not the bulk of how people make money, one, subscriptions, Patreon, Substack. There's a new company called Supporting Cast that helps with podcast subscriptions. I think that if you are trying to make this a business and you're just starting out, Patreon is a great option. If you have like 1,000 paying members, you suddenly are making good money. And obviously that's hard, but a lot of podcasters that we know that started out just making content for like a really small engaged fan base have made a lot more money from subscription than advertising. Live events is another good way for community engagement and feeds well into subscription model. Content licensing, which we talked about. And then the fourth category is like merch. YouTubers do this a lot. I think a lot of people are actually making like pretty decent money selling swag or other types of merch. So none of this is like revolutionary or surprising, but it's similar again to a lot of other media businesses. Okay, yeah, I mean, just to summarize, keys to success to making a podcast. One, make it a unique show. What is it about? Why are you the best host for it? Why now is another really good question. Be informative, be entertaining. Everyone doesn't have, we don't have limitless eartime. So why is this going to be time well spent for whoever you're talking to? Put in the work, give it time, and then finally build something that, if you want to be building a business, build something that can last for hundreds of episodes, not just 5. And that is a good way to test out your show concept as well. What am I going to be speaking about in episode 103? And does my concept have the legs to take me there? Thank you guys. Appreciate it. Any other questions? We have like 5 more minutes. I feel like a lot of good questions throughout the session. Yeah.
I just have one. I think a lot of the podcasts that I end up listening to
Yeah.
have a community around them
Yes.
as well. You put up the fantasy footballers.
Yes.
I've listened to them probably since maybe after they left their closet, so
Yeah.
the last 8 years.
Yeah.
And they really have done an amazing job of building
Amazing.
a community.
Yeah.
Like I listen to them not just for football. They're
Right.
genuinely people I feel like you know.
Yeah.
So long. What's the commitment to like building a community on top of that? I think the Patreon thing was a great example.
Yeah.
How do you at Vox think about like building not only an interesting thing that somebody can jump in and listen to, but a community on it as well?
It's a really good question. I think live is actually a huge piece of this, and other forums, whether it's Discord or some like online forums where people feel like they can get to know the host really well. I think with fantasy footballers, like they're just dads who, like have built this incredible business, and part of it is they feel accessible and knowable. And I think we have another show called Celebrity Memoir Book Club. They host like a ton of small meetups throughout the year. It's not even like it reaches like hundreds of people, but people, they start getting these die-hard fans, and then those people bring in other people for live shows. So I think live meetups are a big opportunity, and then creating forums for fans to engage with each other as well. You don't even need to be there all the time as host, but like if you met another person that was a fantasy footballers fan, like there's incredible connectivity there, and then more loyalty to the brand. So we think a lot about how to create those forums online or in person. It's still something that we're actively thinking about because I don't think we've cracked it yet, and it is so important, the community aspect. But it's basically, how do we gather these people so they can talk to each other or talk to the host, or everyone's engaging with each other, ideally collectively. But it's a really good question. Yeah.
As you mentioned, the last year has been a lot of growth in the sports area.
Yeah.
Are there other verticals that you're looking at as for future expansion?
Yeah, I think we'll continue looking at business and tech because we are just the best at selling that compared to our competitors. So even if a show is kind of small, we're working with a lot of brands that build into that. So that's going to continue to be a focus point. Sports will also continue to be a focus point. We're looking more into this, like, I hate this category term, but this more like lifestyle and women's lifestyle element, just because we don't really have that right now. Brene Brown doesn't fall into that. She's more of like thought leadership, but from Brene and from Esther, we've learned that there's a lot of people that want to work with like everyone basically is like having a ton of news fatigue, and I think we're trying to still platform the voices who are telling important news stories, but also balance that out with content that feels more like, how do I go through life, and it's a little bit lighter fare. So that's another category that we've been thinking a lot about because we don't really have that today. Yeah. Any final questions? Otherwise, thank you guys for being a good audience sorry I was like making visuals with just by talking, but that's a podcast, right? So I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.